Hello, this is Diane Hinchcliffe, and welcome to CXO Talk, episode 177. It's Tuesday, June 21st, and I'm very pleased to announce we have a very special guest joining us today, Jonathan Feldman, the CIO of the city of Asheville, North Carolina, one of my favorite little towns, and we're going to learn a lot more about digital transformation in government. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Diane.
So Jonathan, why don't we get started really quickly, and can you briefly tell us about your IT department in the city of Asheville? Tell us a little bit about the city of Asheville for those that don't know about it, your constituency, and a little bit about your department and about yourself as well.
Absolutely. So the city of Asheville is nestled in the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains in western North Carolina, and we are a huge tourist destination. I appreciate the plug, Diane. I think everyone who's watching this should drop what they're doing right now and go to Asheville, North Carolina, spend lots of money, increase tax base. We like that. We also have been recognized as Beer City USA. So you may not know it, but a few popular breweries are headquartered, have expansions here, such as Sierra Nevada, as well as Highland Brewing, and we also have New Belgium here in town. So it's a very neat tourist scene. Beer is manufacturing. We're excited about that. As far as the department goes, it's a department of 20 folks. We serve 1,100 employees and 85,000 citizens in the city of Asheville. During the day, the population swells to about 120,000. That's because Asheville is such an awesome place, and people love to come here and do business. They love to come here and work. And so the public safety demand, for example, is really of a city of 120,000 and not very much, that 85,000 number. We are very, very mission focused, Diane. That's what I can tell you most of all about the department. When we have a management change here at the city of Asheville, which doesn't happen all that often, but the thing I've heard a couple of times is, I had no idea that it was possible to have an IT organization with people who are and everyone kind of stops, and then they say almost apologetically, friendly, so we don't have the Dilbert no police here. Staff is extremely business focused. We're extremely mission focused. As far as numbers, we serve a 43 square mile area. We cover everything from telecommunications towers for public safety radio systems to traditional finance systems, HRM systems. We do a lot of different lines of business. So we do water manufacturing and SCADA. And that covers, the normal stuff that cities do. So just
that's quite a purview that you've got there. And so, about how large is your department? How many folks are servicing?
20 folks.
And so, usually when we talk to CIOs, they've been kind of brought in at an inflection point. Something had to change, or there was a change in the organization. What is your specific mandate and role in the city of Asheville? What were you brought in originally, at least, to accomplish there?
10 years ago, IT at the city of Asheville was measured to have almost the lowest customer service score of any department in the city. And when the legal department is beating you out, you got a problem. So that was originally my mandate. Customer service was very low. Service availability was very low. And so the first part of my tenure was really righting that ship.
Yeah, and so the whole conversation today about digital experience, was that a discussion back then when you first came on board?
Not at all. Not at all. But as you've seen me say on Twitter, I really believe that operational excellence is a precursor to doing anything innovative, right? Because no one trusts you to do anything cool if you just don't have it together on the operational side.
Right. And so, how was that journey over the last 10 years? Now it sounds like we were talking a little bit before the show, and you were telling us about some of the services you've made available. How did you start making that change in the organization to get people to expect it, to be able to deliver on these new types of digital experiences to satisfy your mission?
Well, I think, as I said, I think that innovation only comes along when you've got ops settled and when you've established a lot of credibility with a larger organization. Um, and once that was established, I think our business partners started trusting us, not only trusting us, Dion, but coming to us first, right? Instead of saying, hey, IT, we have this thing we want to do. Is it okay if we do it in the context of your no police stuff, right? No, because security and all that stuff. Instead, they come to us and say, hey, we have this idea, and how could we do it together? And sometimes we come to them with ideas and say, this is going to be crazy, but what do you think?
Yeah, well, that's really the key. The stance, I think, in the industry has really changed, that IT has to be seen as more and saying, here's what's possible with technology. Here's how we could help your corner of things. So it sounds like you're being proactive about that. Is that right?
Absolutely. We have, we try to integrate that introduction of new ideas along with shepherding of existing projects when we get together with departments. We've got a really good proactive relationship with, I would say, most of the departments here at the city. But we also get out into the community and we do things, and we hear about needs, we hear about gripes, we hear about, gee, you ought to be able to do so and so better. And that allows, and maybe that's reactive, right? But we have existing relationships that allows us to combine all that stuff into a business plan going forward. Metrics and all that kind of operational stuff in conjunction with what we're hearing in the community, what we're hearing from employees. We do a quarterly survey. We get ideas from that as well.
Yeah, no, that sounds like you're making progress. So my question would be then, the hot buzzword of the day is, of course, digital transformation, becoming more digitally native organizations.
Right.
And what are you doing in that regard, that either formally or informally, in terms of actually digitally transforming the services in the city of Asheville?
Well, you're right. Digital transformation is a huge buzzword. When I think of what does digital mean in a government context, for me, it means that citizens are able to do a lot of self-service. It means that citizens aren't frustrated by government, but they're delighted by government. So one of the things that I think has enabled us to react in a more nimble way is that we've adopted startup techniques to be able to meet those challenges, right? If somebody says to you, your existing information portal is terrible, I think the traditional IT way of approaching that would yield something that wouldn't necessarily, the operation would be a success, but the patient would die. And nowadays, I think that we've been able to take those kind of inputs, and by using more rapid development models and assessment models and learning models and iteration models, we've been able to do some really neat product launches, and which I'm happy to talk about if you like.
Well, so we actually have a question from the audience. And so, speaking of surgery on patients, what happens when you have folks in city government that are doing their own surgery? And so we have a question from Arsalan Khan from Twitter, and he's asking, Jonathan, have you encountered shadow IT, And what do you do to change the mindset of your customers about it? So tell us a little bit about your attitude and your response to Shadow IT. And that is, those you were watching, Shadow IT's unsanctioned use of IT tools that you can
Right.
get off the internet or on your mobile device.
Well, I think you have to be like water. And what I mean by that is there's a reason that Shadow IT exists. Shadow IT exists because IT is not fulfilling the need of the business unit. Yes?
Yes.
So I think Shadow IT is a signal that IT needs to more closely engage with the customer. And I believe, and my experience leads me to be pretty firm about this, that when you take those Shadow IT ideas or tools and you explain to folks that we need governance, we need, wrapped around that, what you're doing is great. Let's talk about some scenarios. And I'm not talking about this because Jonathan wants to be a control freak. I'm talking about, let's talk about what happens when someone leaves the organization and they take all the files with them, right? Let's talk about what happens when someone gets terminated. And you start talking about that with smart, with savvy business managers, and they say, ooh, I got a concern about that too. Can you help me? But that's not IT leading with a solution. That's IT saying, IT doesn't say no, but IT needs to say, and we have this conversation in my management team meeting, we need to say yes and.
Yes.
Yes, we want you to have the tools that you need. And what are we going to do? We, not what are you going to do about it, but what are we going to do about that?
Yeah, and so this has been, I think the great debate is that you can certainly bring up a lot of cases, edge cases. You brought up some of them where, the outcomes, the risks seem to be too high to allow Shadow IT. Yet it's clear that as a centralized IT department, we can't possibly enable all the technological change. So how do you cut it in the middle? How do you manage? How does IT manage risk, and how does it govern everything in the organization, but still enabling all this kind of creativity on the edge?
Stop thinking about Shadow IT and start thinking about self-service IT and IT governance, right?
That's a great soundbite. Yeah, I
I
think
mean,
makes a lot
because
of
if
sense.
IT can add value, and I say this at meetings all the time, and I had to say it a lot more at the beginning, right? Because you had a lot of traditional IT folks and it needed saying more at the beginning, right? But if IT can add value, I want us in there. If we can't, why would I want to spend taxpayer money on that? Right?
Is it what? No, yeah, but you keep your seat at the table. If they're not coming to you, you can't possibly guide them and say, well, what you're doing is almost right, but if we did this extra thing, our data would be safe, and then it would be maybe okay to do that,
Right.
right?
Right.
No, so
So
that's I think that's a good. We'll touch on, I think, Shadow IT and other related topics here as we go along. But let's get back to digital transformation and the public sector. Now, for a lot of the public sector, that means things like cloud, right?
right.
But there's a lot of things you really can't do off premises and still maintain the mandate, in terms of data security and certainly a lot of governments handle information that can't pop. We make the case, at least now, you can't put that in the cloud. What else is where else can the public sector benefit from digital transformation?
Well, let's talk a little bit about what you can and what you cannot put in the cloud, right? And I would say to you that I believe IT has a stewardship role, not an ownership role. And I think the people who can answer the question about can something be put into the cloud need to be educated about what that means, and then they need to be the ones to decide. Because most of the time, and I think especially for most of the cities in the US, because most of them are pretty dang small, right? Not everything's New York, not everything's Raleigh. And for small municipalities, there's no way you have a security team the size of Amazon's or as effective as Amazon's or effective as Google's or Microsoft's. So I think you have to not have confirmation bias when you go into these conversations, number one. And number two, I think the customer decides. I don't think IT decides. IT has a guidance role, IT can make a recommendation, but ultimately, why is it that somebody would trust my W-2 employee to secure their data, right? Using encryption, using, all these things, versus an Amazon employee who's a W-2 employee, plus my employee who does all the server configuration. Why is that more or less trustworthy? And I think you have to ask that question.
Exactly right. And so when we brought you on board, we realized that the city of Asheville has a Twitter account and it was very active. How much has social media been a part of the digital transformation of the public sector? Has that changed things? Has that connected the city better to its citizens? What's the story there?
Our engagement efforts, right, under which I would put social media as a subset of that, but our engagement efforts, I think, have gone a long way to help us develop products and services that citizens need. And you'll hear me talk about products and services, right? Because I'm a business school graduate. I am not a master of public administration. So sometimes that it makes me a little bit of an oddball out here at the city of Asheville. But I think the concepts are very similar. And when we're talking about products and services, we're basically talking about things like information portals. We're talking about better ways of doing customer service, because ultimately, if you're a city of Asheville water customer, for example, you're a captive audience, right? But we collaborate with every department on engagement. Our social media has been excellent in terms of letting folks know about events that affect them, whether it's weather related and whatnot. But we supplement that with other digital technologies. So you can sign up at City of Asheville to be notified if there's a water break in your neighborhood, for example.
Yeah, so this brings up, I think, an interesting point that if we touched on, you said the word portal, and when I hear that, I think, I don't think of the most modern technology, and these days,
I'm just
experience, yeah, we have to call it something, right?
Right.
But these days, customer experience is where the customer want it on the channel of their choice in the application in a digital way that they want to work with you,
Right.
and so. It seems like there's, you still have to have the portal. That's the tough part. Is that there's a lot of people expecting the old things that were always there and they know how to use, but there's a newer, your younger constituents that want to engage with you in different ways. It's the whole omni-channel and the whole digital experience conversation and the continuum. Where are you coming in on that? Is that kind of your next horizon, or how do you look at that?
I think, we approach engagement as meeting the citizen where he or she lives. And let me tell you a story, okay? So we used to have a service called Map Asheville. And when I showed it to my octogenarian father, he looked at it and said, "Johnny, I have no idea what this is," right? And he couldn't use it. It was too many bells and whistles. It looked like enterprise IT. And we put together a successor to that was based on a lot of user experience testing. It was based on usability principles, and it was called Simplicity. And it looks a lot.
It's actually available right now. Is it?
Yeah. It's simplicity.asheville.nc.gov. And when you're spelling Asheville, remember that evil is in the middle of it.
In there.
So, so when I showed my dad that product, which, he said, "Oh, that looks like Google. I can use that." And he's 80 years old. But it's still, you still have to remember, and our citizen and public engagement folks are always reminding me of this, because I'm very I'm very electronic and I like things to be electronic, but we still need to do, we still need to meet especially elderly folks where they live. And sometimes that means putting signs in yard or, signs, planning and zoning put signs out that talk about proposed changes. Um,
Because they're not going to be following the city of Asheville Twitter account, presumably,
Not
right? Yeah.
all,
So
right,
yeah. So this is, I think, this is the challenge that that everyone has, but government probably in particular,
right.
is this channel fragmentation, and that the customers are not so much moving as they are spreading out, right? And we have to touch them wherever they are. But to getting back to what you did, the name Simplicity sounds very aspirational, and I think kind of sets an expectation there. Was that a really important part of rolling that out?
Absolutely. We've been talking about simplicity as it relates to business technology for years here at Asheville IT Services. And so when we were looking to create a successor to this Map Asheville portal, we said, well, you know, what do people really want out of city government? And surprise, surprise, we did not attempt to answer that question. We went out and we went to coffee shops and we went to meetings and that kind of thing. And we asked people what they wanted. And as it turns out, people want answers to their questions. They don't actually want data, right? We did a lot with the open data movement back in the
Hmm.
day, and we were one of the first cities in the Southeast to have an open data portal. And that's all very interesting because it automates public records that are open anyway, right? And it takes a lot of manual effort out of the equation and it makes it self-service, and that's great. Except what most people want is an answer to their question,
Hmm.
not a big gob of data.
Yeah, they want outcomes, right? But in terms of, I mean, we'll get to the open data question before we're done here, because I think that's been a very exciting development. But doesn't it enable kind of an intermediate layer of developers and startups to say, hey, we can build other services that we can monetize on top of that data? Isn't that what happens? Or not
You
so much?
can't.
I mean, some citizens will use data, of course, but I think we're seeing this broadly with things like hackathons, that IT departments are looking for new ways to empower creativity,
Oh,
saying
sure.
that I can't do everything myself. Maybe I can help other people do it. You know.
Right. And we have sponsored hackathons. We've participated in hackathons. Um, Back in the day when some folks were shaking their heads and saying, "What city IT doing having a having a conference or having a whatever? You guys don't belong in the public." Well, as it turns out, we do. Not all the time, not every day, but to get some objectives accomplished, we do have to interact with the public, and that was a huge change of thinking. And I'll just sidebar that by saying we have a visionary CEO, city manager, who understood that for us to start focusing on public technology and public engagement, we had to reorganize around that. So we did that.
Well, that's a really significant move, and we're seeing a lot of organizations saying, "How do I structure myself? How do I organize what we do to be more digital?" And so there's all these arguments about the CMO and the CDO, the Chief Digital Officer. There's another CDO, Chief Data Officer, which I'm noticing in a lot of companies
Right.
now, and the CIO. We're all supposed to be doing these digital things. What decisions did you make? I mean, how did you decide how to structure yourselves for the next generation of digital?
So first of all, I think that when you need a chief anything, it's just a sign that it's not getting done, right? I mean, when you have a chief security officer, maybe that means that security is good, maybe it doesn't, but it means that someone is placing a huge emphasis on it,
Hmm.
right? And if data was being handled appropriately, maybe you wouldn't need a CDO. If
Well,
digital
it's a
was
place. The sea level's the place where the buck stops, right?
right,
There's this.
right,
I've had to find somebody who's responsible for this. I know who they are, right? And we can make that change if we need to.
right. So as far as how we structured, I feel very strongly that public technology is a major component of what we are responsible for as government technologists. I think you've seen that at the federal level with, I think it's called 18F,
Hmm.
with Digital Core in the UK. There was, an Office of Digital Transformation in the UK, and I think they were pretty successful with
Yeah,
that.
well, there's a number of the UK government, I think, has been very advanced in the way that they
Yes,
look at digital, and some of the reports and the work that they've been doing is
absolutely.
great.
But
Has that been an inspiration for you at all? Sounds like it
absolutely,
has.
absolutely. But fundamentally, if you want to get digital in government, I think there's two things that have to happen, right? Number one, you've got to you can't go digital without digital employees, right? And that means people who are familiar with what digital natives want. Um, and I think the other thing that is a must is that you can't do business in the same way. You can't expect that you're going to be organized around keeping the servers running, or we exist to be the priests of the database, and expect that you're going to be customer focused, because that's what has to happen first. You
Yeah,
cannot
well,
achieve
it's
digital
really
without customer.
it's
Yeah,
people. It's all about people, whether that's your customers or
yeah,
that those are the workers inside your organization. The hardest part about digital transformation is changing people. Technology, ironically, is actually simpler, right? So we're about halfway through
great.
this episode 177 of CXO Talk. We've got Jonathan Feldman, the CIO of the city of Asheville, who has kindly joined us today to tell us about digital transformation in government. For those of you watching, we would love to take your questions on Twitter. If you will mention the CXO Talk hashtag, that's CXO Talk, or the CXO Talk account, either one, we'll get your questions and we'd love to answer them. And so, Jonathan, let's move on to I think the next exciting topic, one that's personally interesting for you. It's my understanding you're a proponent and an active participant in startup culture. And I was wondering what the connection between startup culture and city government is. I've seen this in Europe a lot, where they actually give a lot of space in the IT department to let startups come in and do interesting things. But what are you guys doing?
So we have a very active relationship with, first of all, with Code for America. And if you're not familiar with Code for America, they're a not-for-profit headquartered in Silicon Valley. And they started out with a program that was very much Peace Corps for geeks. And they would have, you know, best and brightest of Silicon Valley volunteer with a stipend, a year of their time, to make government better. And it was everyone from marketers to programmers to folks who were, civically minded, civically motivated. And by all counts, it's a very successful program. So we have a great relationship with them. We love them. They are doing amazing work. Um, and part of what they do, and part of what we modeled ourselves on, is that they're very startup friendly, because the the core of a startup is offering a value proposition. The core of a startup is disrupting something. And I'm fond of saying to staff, we got to get on the bus or we're going to be run over by the bus.
Hmm.
And it's so true about any kind of disruption. If you adopt it and you, as I said, be like water, right? Whether it's shadow IT or any kind of disruption, right? Shadow IT could be considered a disruption, right?
Hmm.
And
Absolutely. I think it is. It's the canary in the coal mine, right? And
right,
the numbers are really startling. 10% of IT was shadow IT in the year 2000. 5 years ago, it was about 25%. Now it's closing in on 35%.
right.
And pretty
It's a
soon it's
sign
going
of
to
the
be
times.
most of IT. Now, mostly it's edge IT, of course. So that's very
Right.
interesting. So you kind of answered my next question, but I'm gonna kind of phrase it just to make it clear anyway.
Sure.
And so, is local government at risk for disruption today? Is that
Oh, absolutely.
yeah? It sounds like you already believe that.
I do believe that, because we see it all the time. Social media changed the conversation between I mean, we know this at a national level, right? If you look at presidential elections, last couple of cycles and this cycle, um, delete your account,
Yes, exactly.
right? I mean, it's that was the news of the day. And that is no less true in local government. You just don't hear about it. But we do working inside government. So disruption is not only coming, it's here in local government.
Now, where's it gonna come from? I mean, what sort of things are you seeing the private sector maybe competing with you on, or other things that are actively disrupting that maybe that folks outside of government like ourselves haven't heard of?
So a great example is open data. I think that those municipalities who have not gotten on the bus have, if not run over by the bus, have at least had a near miss with the bus. Because what ends up happening is you have civic technologists collect your data for you, and then they draw conclusions that that might not be accurate. But if you cooperate with the open data movement and you say, great, we love transparency, and here it is, and we would love for you to help us solve a problem, it changes the conversation.
No, it really does. And what I've noticed is that when I've been at a few city government events where some of the counties have open data initiatives and a few others don't. And when they come together and see what the other counties have done, their success stories, all the very innovative things that have come about. One city had published all of their data about which sidewalks were wheelchair compatible.
Right.
And then people who visited the city, somebody had built an app so you could navigate the city, making sure you could go only in places where you could actually travel, right?
That's right.
And opened up tourism opportunities for a whole new community of people. And the counties who didn't have open data didn't have any stories like that.
That's right. That's right. I mean, and it's sort of in a sharing economy kind of way. Not everything that's made available to citizens is on the backs of taxpayers. And I'll give you an example. If you go to avlbudget.org, it's a beautiful graphical, I want to say Web 2.0, but that'll make me sound really old. But it's a nice and modern app that shows you how city dollars are being spent in this heat map, and it's really user friendly. And the city of Asheville didn't actually code that. We just made the data available to a bunch of civic technologists and hackers and people who are interested in it, and they coded it, not us.
Yeah, well, that seems to be the pattern, right? It's
Right.
that we have to let the network do the work, but you
Right.
have to give them the raw resources to do that. And so, what are in your experience, the CIO of the city of Asheville now for a decade? What are the best targets for digital transformation? If you saw a public sector CIO coming in right now, where do you think the opportunity is most likely to lie that they haven't maybe already been done yet?
That's an interesting question, Dion. I think the problem is that IT is so very broken in so very many places. And I think the danger is flying in and saying day one, we're going digital. I think that would be arrogant, because I think there's so many things.
And it certainly would be uninformed if it's day one, right? I mean, that's the thing.
Say it again.
It certainly would be uninformed too if it's day one, right?
Right.
You would want to learn, not just the knee-jerk reaction. So yeah, exactly.
Right. So don't misunderstand me. I don't mean that we would ignore the mission imperative, but what we would do. See, that's our excellent energy conservation kicking in. I'm not moving enough around here. So I'm not saying you wouldn't do anything, right? Because of course you have to do something. But it would likely be pretty bite-sized. It would likely be.
You want a quick win, right? I mean, that's in your first 100 days. You've got to make some kind of visible change.
Exactly. I'll give you a great example. We were recruiting for a programmer analyst, and we really wanted some design skills, and we really wanted various things. And our business and public technology manager is an awesome guy. His name's Scott Barnwell. and he's so civic minded, and he's so mission focused, and he had his ear to the ground, and knew that city council was working on a graffiti initiative. So what did he do? He asked all of the job candidates in a very, 2014, 2015 kind of way, here's an exercise, do it in the cloud, make an app. And so we ended up hiring somebody, based upon that work. I love that method of hiring, by the way, but we can talk about it if you want. The end result was we had this sort of skeletal prototype app in place. And not 2 weeks after this fellow got hired, City Council said, we really need an app to do that. And so the result was this app that was around for a year or two, and it fulfilled the function, but it was all hosted in Amazon, and it didn't require big IT or server space or anything like that. So I think if you're going to be effective day one, rent, don't buy, right? And that means cloud.
Yeah, well, and we saw that certainly one of the best case studies out there right now is the Federal Communications Commission. Their CIO, David Bray,
Right.
He forklifted virtually all of their existing applications out to the cloud in just 1 year. Something that most people would think is impossible, right?
Right.
But he's tapping into the power of his organization.
Right.
But so let's go back to that, because I see that I track a lot of the industry data, and now most of it is lining up with around 2017 or 2018. Public cloud will be the primary form of IT. If you look at all the workloads, all the on-premises workloads and all the off-prem workloads, public cloud is at last going to be bigger. It's going to be the majority of IT out there.
I don't disagree.
That's a big change. But if you plot that curve forward 3 or 4 more years, it's virtually all of IT, right? I mean, we're seeing the hollowing out of the data center. Do you think it's going to go that far with public sector? I mean, Michael Krigsman, founder of the show, and I have talked about with Casey Coleman, when she was in charge of the GSA, their IT department. She said, cloud is it. So I mean, the vision is there, but what's really going to happen? What do you think is going to take place?
So I think that if you are mid-sized to large, you're probably going to be mostly in the cloud, right? If you are supersize, if you're GM and you're Randy Mott and you can decide that you're going to insource everything and the cloud is not where you're going, but you have the resources to have a national footprint and have as many data centers as it takes, I think you have an option. I don't happen to agree with that option, and that's not what I would do at that scale.
Well, yeah, I think that the biggest players could do it, take the Amazon route and say they'll onboard additional people to get the economies of scale. They'll say, you can use our unused cloud capacity, right?
Right.
But most people can't do that. But the government's big enough to do that, right?
Right.
So, certainly the federal government is big enough to really get into that business, but doesn't seem to be showing any interest in doing that. But I don't think we've seen the end of that story. I know I'm based out of Washington, D.C., and so I'm very familiar with the public sector issues.
Yeah.
Now, the intelligence community is never going to go there. There's 17 agencies, right?
No, that's exactly right.
So, but I say never's a long time. All right. So,
never is a long time. And when you're operating at the scale of the federal government, you get to have conversations with Amazon.
Yes, with Jeff personally.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So who knows what's going on in terms of, the Gov Cloud having a Gov CIA secret component. We're never going to know that.
Yeah, well, I think we're got to see the other shoe will drop, but I think the public sector and cloud is an inevitability. I just think it's going to take longer.
Right. And in government, I think you're really going to have to start, especially with CFOs and chief executives who are very familiar, they're cloud natives. You're going to really have to have an almost airtight business case to prove that you should be spending that much more on internal resourcing, because it's a lot more expensive than I think traditional IT folks realize.
Yeah, we really haven't had the data. I mean, until recently. Now it looks like cloud IT is about, if you take into account all the costs, all the people it takes to run your data center and all the power and all the floor space and all the maintenance and upgrades, and you factor in the total cost, cloud is about half the cost on average, right? I think it's
Yeah.
about 52, 53%. I think that's PwC data. You better have an airtight case to say, well, I want to spend twice as much. And it has competitive implications for companies. You have a lot of IT in your company and you're going to pay twice as much, it's not going to work. But that takes us back to the public sector, which is a very different environment. It doesn't have the competitive pressures that private sector companies do.
Right.
You're going to get your tax revenue, you're going to get your payments from your citizens no matter what. What's the imperative to do these things when you don't really have the competitive pressure? There's not two cities governments of Asheville competing against each other. There's just one.
I think it's a lot about fiscal responsibility. And I think it's a lot about what the governing board brings to bear in terms of expertise and in terms of business savvy, which means business technology savvy. I just don't think you're going to be able to, instead of competitiveness in the government environment, you start thinking of it as trade-offs. Would you rather have, 6 more patrol cars and 5 more police officers, or would you rather do totally insourced IT? I know what I would pick.
Yeah, right. But I mean, isn't there in fact a competitive implication? When businesses look to move to North Carolina, don't they look at, I could go to Asheville, which is really
Mhm.
cool and quirky, or I could go to Raleigh, which is bigger city and offer me a bigger customer base.
Right.
They're going to look at, all right, so how well is this government going to support my business? Doesn't that happen?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm involved in a broadband effort to ramp up some of the broadband presence here in Western North Carolina. Although we are very blessed with a tremendous amount of fiber here, but we're not Kansas City, we're not Chattanooga by any stretch in terms of offering gigabit to the home through commercial providers. So that's on the radar of our decision makers, and it is a competitive factor. We talk about site selection a lot. New Belgium and Sierra Nevada did not select us, um, you know, solely based on one factor, right? It had to do with quality of water, it had to do with logistics and access to highways. But when I talk to our economic development director, he says, "Oh yeah, broadband and access to multi-path broadband is really important to them as well."
Yeah, right. So we have a few minutes left, and so we wanted to ask you a couple more questions. I think we should wrap up on, I think, a topic that you're very passionate about, and that's usability.
Sure.
Evidently you had a lot of the vision around the Simplicity portal, and some of the things that you did there. Can you kind of give us your point of view on how governments can make their IT services more usable, the process that you use, and what you'd recommend?
I think usability starts on customer focus. I think if you're not hiring for customer focus in IT, you're doing it wrong, and perhaps you should be running a data center instead. So I think it starts there, because if you don't have staff that is passionate about making sure the customer is okay, you can throw the rest of usability out the window. But there are there have just been some amazing aha moments when we started focusing on usability. Give you a quick example. There was one website that I won't name the department, had been brought to a service bureau, which is cool. I love selective outsourcing, right? We don't need to be everything to everybody. We need to have core competencies, and then we need to go to the marketplace for other things. But they brought back this website, and because of that trust and the credibility that I described earlier, they came to us and said, "Well, what do you think? How'd they do?" And two of the folks who had really been studying up on usability looked at it and said, "Well, we're not going to judge that. Why don't we run some usability tests?" And so they did, and they just watched people try to achieve these goals on this, brand spanking new, really fancy website. And when I say achieve goals, I mean find information that you need, get what you want, those kind of things. The reason why you go to a website. And it took it was taking people 15 minutes to find what they wanted to achieve these goals.
Yeah, well, but a lot of user abandonment along the way. So
Yeah,
yeah, it was
right.
inspiring to see what you have done there, and you have concrete examples that you could point to. So
Absolutely.
so
And so,
that brings us to the end of a successful episode of CXO Talk. I'd like to thank our very special guest, Jonathan Feldman, the CIO of the City of Asheville, for joining us. And we have, I think, a couple more shows this week. You can go to cxo.com and see what we have on tap. So thanks, Jonathan, again for joining us. And
my
have a
pleasure.